the idea of beauty is something that all people have experienced. It's something that people have in common all over the world. Having the ideal appearance has set a somewhat unreachable standard for centuries. People's ideals of beauty, they go through sort of a cycle throughout all of history. The too big, too small debate that we have going on right now isn't recent. That's been going on since people first settled down in tribes together. Because when we first settled and formed a society, so to speak, that's when we started judging each other and ourselves. And that's when the ideal of beauty came through. That's when it became what we know. So at first, in these different societies, in these tribal societies, the idea of bigger was better was the very first one we had, because what you wanted was more than to survive. You wanted to live. You wanted luxury. You wanted the ability to feed your family and have healthy children. And so if you were bigger, you could do that because it meant that you had more than the necessities. And that went on throughout ancient times. But as people grew and people expanded and created more civilized areas, and when we started civilizations, that's when we began to sort of change our ideals of beauty. When people decided to have different opinions. And so that's when skinny started coming in. In ancient Greece and ancient Rome, people would wear long flowing outfits. And so because of that long tunics with buckles on the sleeves and around the edges, both men and women would wear similar garments. So women and men started to sort of look almost the same. Women would start to bind their chest because they thought that having a long, thin torso that was of the sort of the same length and size was beautiful. And this goes on again in the 14th century because the ideal sort of cycles. Throughout ancient Rome, it was the same thing, except when we reached the classical period of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, the ideal became bigger because the artists started drawing natural bodies of people because they wanted people to look like people. And so everyone looked at this and said, okay, well, you know what? Maybe bigger is better. But in the Middle Ages, far after this, when they're just rediscovering ancient Greece and ancient Rome again, they went back to the ideal of skinny. People started wearing specialized corsets and they would bind their chests again. This is the 14th century. And the pale face made a comeback. People figured that if you had a pale face and you had very, very light hair, it meant that you didn't have to work outside. You had the luxury of being able to stay inside and be pampered. You didn't have to go and work out in the hot sun for your family. So people would dye their hair and they would put powders on their face. Now, this is when beauty starts to come at a severe price, because what people used for this is they used poisonous powders. They would use mercury and white lead to appear to have an even facial tone and look and have very pale faces. Both men and women would have pale faces because they thought it was beautiful. The blonde hair they would use onion skin and saffron leaf and bleach. And they would kind of grind it into a paste, and they would, along with other items, and they would put it in their hair. And unfortunately, they'd have to sit outside in the sun for a very, very long time for this to actually take effect and begin to bleach their hair. But you don't want to have a sunburned face because you want to be pale, because that was beautiful. So what did they do? They decided to invent the crownless hat. And they would go outside and they would coat themselves in layers of fabric in the sweltering hot sun and sit there for hours with just their hair exposed, both men and women, because men had longer hair as well, in order to get that perfect blonde. And as we move on to the Renaissance, around 1400 to 1600, the bigger is better came back once again, because the new artists from the Renaissance were drawing people as people. Women were voluptuous and big, so were men, because you didn't have to conform to this ultra-muscled stereotype. People could have their natural bodies and enjoy it. That's that was when things got really big. But unfortunately, when you go for the bigger is better, people sort of overdid it, and people became obese, and there was health problems, which sort of arises if you go for that, as we know from now on, from today, because of our surplus of food. Pale skin, still the same thing, but what was new was the plucked hairlines. Women would take up to the crown of their head, right up here. What they would do is they would pluck all of their hair from that back, and they would pull their head back, they would put their hair back because they thought that a full forehead was beautiful. It's just one of those things. It's a cultural norm. When you look back at it, it's similar to looking back at an outfit that you loved as a child. You look back on it and you go, oh my God, did I really wear that? Did I really like that? And then, but at the time, it seemed awesome to you. It seemed wonderful. Men would also have very well-trimmed beards and mustaches and facial hair, and they wouldn't have the elaborate hair, but it would still be around this long. Now, the thing is, men, throughout history, historically, have had less social burden put on them to be beautiful, so to speak. Just because, we don't really know because, it's just something we do. It's one of the things that people do. But as you get to more and more people, the ideal sort of expands. Nowadays, in the 21st century, there's a lot more pressure on men to be manly and be masculine, but it isn't always that way. White teeth, that was also a huge thing back in the Renaissance period. People would use ground up animal bone and other whitening mixtures, and they would put them on their teeth in order to gain that perfect white, because you wanted to go for a pale, except for dramatic lips and dramatic eyes. And interesting fact, in 1434, if you were a woman, if you looked pregnant, that was the epitome of beautiful. Now, in around the 1600s to the 1800s, we sort of found the balance between too big and too small. Curvy was good. Corsets were huge again because people wanted that sort of hourglass figure. And people stopped using the poisonous powders on their faces because makeup was considered cheap and tawdry, and you didn't want to wear it. So what did they do? They used potions and concoctions and all sorts of different serums, and they would drink it. And unfortunately, this stuff also contained the same poisons that were found in earlier facial powders. So both men and women would end up with very, very pale, translucent skin that was poisoning from the inside, and there was a lot of health problems, and it was not good. But then again, it just shows that the ideal of beauty isn't always beautiful. A lot of the time, beauty comes with a price. Around the world, you see that. This is a very Eurocentric video because we know a lot more about Europe and about America and about these areas because they're closer to us. But in areas like China, bound feet. Girls, before they grew up, they would have their feet practically bent in half and wrapped with strips of cloth. And they would have to hobble everywhere because it was so painful they couldn't do anything. And except the reason why they did it is because they were told it was beautiful. They were told that no man would want to marry a woman with large feet. And so they would hide their feet underneath socks and slippers, and they would never take them off, not even when they were going to bed or taking a bath, because it was awful. They had all sorts of health problems, and they couldn't walk anywhere for very long periods of time. If you go over to Africa, in ancient times, people would, and the Mayans as well, they would wrap babies' heads. The Mayans would use 2 planks and some strips of tree bark or cloth to create a conical shape. The Africans did it with giraffe hide, so when you grew up, your head was in a large cone shape, and because that was considered that you would look beautiful and intelligent, because that's what a bigger head meant. Also in different areas of Africa, putting rings around your neck. A girl would start out with 5 rings at a certain age, and then each year she grew, she would put on another ring. There were women who had 24 rings on their neck. The average length in the suspected beauty was 15 inches of neck was considered beautiful. Same thing with lip plates. People would insert lip plates into people. And nowadays, even people all over the world, we pay to have surgeries on our bodies to make ourselves look beautiful. Throughout history, we see the reoccurring theme that beauty comes with a price. However, sometimes we are blind to this price. By following others and those who we perceive as the beautiful people, i.e. the upper class, the rock stars, the celebrities, and the kings and queens of past history, the nobles, so to speak. By doing this, we can really hurt each other and we can really hurt ourselves. And that's the idea of beauty. That's what happens throughout history. Thank you for coming. Thank you for watching this. Have a good time with Youth Rally.